What's up, everybody? I hope you all had a great Memorial Day weekend. I spent mine in COVID testing transit hell, but we finally made it to our destination, which is the island of Kauai in Hawaii, and it is amazing, I gotta say. It's my first time in Hawaii, and it is everything I could have possibly hoped it would be. So I am recording this intro from my residence on the island, which is why it's going to sound a bit different than what you're used to. In place of a normal episode, I'm releasing a recent appearance I made on the Grant Williams podcast. Grant has been on the show before, twice on his own and twice as a guest along with Ben Hunt. So I cannot express to you guys what an honor it was for me to be invited onto his podcast. Not only because he's such a great interviewer, and because he has such a large and engaged audience, but also because he's someone I've always looked towards for guidance and as a role model for how to navigate what is a very cutthroat business with integrity, sincerity, and a lot of class. We spent the first 20 minutes or so on my bio and how I got started in media and the origins of hidden forces, and then everything after that is an exploration of many of the various forces that I've talked about on this podcast, things like the phenomenon of financial nihilism, the hyperreality of markets and society, China and the changing geopolitical order, and much more. Grant's podcast is for subscribers only, so I'm very grateful to him for letting me share it with all of you on my own feed. This is not a normal occurrence. And he also publishes a newsletter, which is one of my favorite newsletters and the only one I regularly read. And that's because I love his perspective and how he incorporates metaphor with charts and data to tell a story, so that what you're reading isn't only educational, but it's also entertaining. So I cannot recommend his stuff enough. If you're interested in learning more about Grant and how to become a subscriber to both his podcast and his monthly newsletter, you can do that at grant-williams.com. There are sample newsletters that you can read, and of course, you have today's podcast as a sample of what to expect from the Grant Williams podcast. So without any further ado, please enjoy my recent appearance on the Grant Williams podcast with my friend, Grant Williams.
Well, Demetri, mate, I am so pleased to get the chance to turn the microphone to you. Thanks for doing this for me. I really appreciate it.
This is so cool, man. Thank you for having me.
You know, you and I was thinking about this week as I've been kind of thinking about the stuff I want to talk to you about. And I went back to, you and I first met, it'll be almost 10 years ago now, when we had dinner in New York City. And,
even longer. Oh, you're right. 10 years ago.
Yeah, about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago.
But you had been on Capital Account, hadn't you?
Yeah, I had been on Capital Account, which is where the kind of connection came from. And we had a great dinner down in a meatpacking district in New York City, and that was a lot of fun. But that was 10 years ago. And then you know, you and I lost touch, and I didn't really understand why we lost touch. It wasn't that we were in constant contact or anything, but we kind of lost touch for a couple of years. And it wasn't until we reconnected a few years later that I kind of, you explained what had been happening in your life and what an unbelievable story it was. And so what I want to do, if we can, to start this podcast, because I think there's a lot of people that listen to Hidden Forces. And, you know, you're such a great host, but we don't get the chance that often to listen to you tell your story. And so I want to really go back to the Capital Account days, how that all happened, you know, the kind of personal life events that happened after that. And then I really want to dig into the meat of Hidden Forces, because you and I share a lot of similar beliefs and kind of thought processes around what's important. And I really want to sit down and have a chance to discuss that with you. So if you can, just take us back and take all the time you want. You can dwell on the bits that you think are important and skip over the bits that you don't. And I'll maybe make you rewind and maybe not. Let's see how we go.
Well, I guess it depends on where we start. I mean, I guess the way I think of the starting point of my career was once I got into radio. I mean, I had been blogging on the side because, you know, you and I began our careers at a time where blogs were really a great way to get your content out. And I had a blog and I was blogging and no one was really reading it, but I was blogging anyway because I enjoyed it. And then eventually I got on radio. I got our radio program. I had absolutely no experience in radio. And I just took to it. It was absolutely natural for me, and I enjoyed it so much. It was the first opportunity I had to reach out to all these people who I respected from afar and who were like celebrities to me. You know this. I told you my experience with Jim Grant. That's how Jim and I met. I went to a gold conference where he was there. And I think the other people on stage were Michael Steinhardt and Edward Chancellor, and it was a gold debate. And so I asked him a question. I tried to get him on my show. Eventually, I did get him. I got him on my TV show. But even in my television show, I had absolutely no experience in television, and I had only been on TV for the first time a couple of months before I got an offer to create my own TV program.
Right.
And that was a daily live program.
Yeah.
And that experience was, I was also telling you this, I've been reading Tim Grover's book. Tim Grover is the former personal trainer for Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and a lot of the greatest athletes of all time. And he talks about like what it's like to really try and strive for that. Again, he's talking about people that are trying to, win NBA championships.
Yeah.
But for me, Capital Account was the equivalent of that. It was this incredibly insane idea for a 30-year-old kid who has absolutely no experience in TV to just stroll into a television studio, convince the executives that they should hand them the keys to the castle, and then corral a group of people with degrees from McGill and Northwestern and other places, professional journalists, to actually listen to what he has to say. And it was an incredible experience. I mean, I operated under immense amounts of stress for 2 years. That probably played a role in what eventually were symptoms of a brain tumor that I had going into the job. A big reason why I did it in the first place was because I knew that I had a limited amount of time, or I didn't know how much time I had because of a diagnosis I had gotten only a couple years earlier. So it was this incredible experience. I got to meet you. I got to meet all sorts of people, put on this incredible program, and touch so many people and interact with so many people. And I just loved it. And you know this, when we had met in New York City for the first time, I was dealing with severe symptoms. I think it was like May of 2013.
Yeah, springtime, yeah.
Yeah, and I was dealing with severe dementia at the time. I probably at that point still didn't know if I had, because I was afraid to go get checked up again. I was avoiding getting blood tests. Sure. I knew I had a brain tumor, but I just didn't want to accept the possibility that my brain tumor had grown to a place where it was causing dementia, which were symptoms that I was never told I would get. So I had such a fatalistic view of the whole situation that my sort of view was, well, I'm going to die from this thing, so I'll just run the wheels off the train, and that's how I lived my life. And so that experience, so to speak, anyway, with Capital Account stayed with me. And after my recovery from brain surgery, which I got about a month after you and I went to dinner. Well, do you remember the restaurant we were at?
I remember it very well. I couldn't tell you what it was called, but I
thought it was called. I thought we were at Otto for some reason, which would have been on 8th Street. That was my memory, a pizza place. But I might have been thinking of a different place because you said meatpacking. You said meatpacking.
You may be right. It was definitely on the meatpacking district. I remember that.
Okay. Oh, it was? Okay. I remember it. For some reason, I had it in my head that we met at Otto and Oteca. What's his name's restaurant? The guy that has those Italian restaurants. Anyway, he got Me Too'd also, like a bunch of these other guys. And it was on 8th Street. That was my memory. But I got all those memories back after my brain surgery. You know, I had they were written to the hard drive, but I didn't have access to them.
Yeah.
And there was I've written a whole article about this. But anyway, after my brain surgery, I struggled. This was, I had gone through such a long period of, in some sense, suffering, struggling, etc., to get to a place where I was living the life that I always wanted but didn't know what it was, which was when I created my radio program in New York and then the TV show, to then losing it all and having to start all over again. And this, again, I brought up Tim's book. This is kind of why I brought up Tim's book, because he talks about these types of examples. He talks about the road to paradise starting in hell, and that's what it was like coming back and really having lost any desire to do anything like I was doing when I had Capital Account, but still wanting that. whatever it was.
Yeah.
Wanting that passion, that sense of like mission every day, waking up and just throwing yourself right into the meat grinder and not knowing how it's going to work, how you're going to do it, but coming out the other end over and over and over again. And that experience of being under immense amounts of stress and it breaking you and revealing all the worst and best parts about you and all the other people that you work with. And, you know, that's ultimately like the memories that I have from that period are both how the challenge of actually doing it and also these incredible relationships that I formed with people under immense stress doing something that was just totally insane.
Well, let me ask you, let's go back to when you actually landed that capital account job, because how the hell did you do that? Because as you said, right, that's an incredible thing to convince someone to do. And then, but once you got it, you know, I remember the first time I changed jobs. I'd been working for 10 years in the same place and I'd spent time in Tokyo for them and came back to London and I'd had multiple job offers, and my boss, who was a great friend of mine, I would always tell him when I had a job offer, I say, look, I've been offered this. And he would always say, no. And eventually one came along and he said to me, this is the one you've got to take. And if you don't take it, I'm going to fire you. So I took that job, but I remember being excited about it, but spending the first 6 months terrified, feeling completely out of my depth, feeling a total fraud, feeling I was going to get found out any minute now. It's like, I've made a huge mistake here. How did you experience that, or were you so focused? And if so, how did you, because I was just one partner cog. You're the guy, right? So you can't quietly sit down and learn from other people and, you know, take a little back seat until you find your feet. You've got to go in there guns blazing and lead the thing. So how did you deal with that?
You know, I was terrified. In fact, fear really held me back in the early part of my life. And being diagnosed with a brain tumor at the age of 20, I think it was 28 now, it liberated me. And I remember distinctly a moment of sheer terror might be a little bit of a stretch. As close as you can get to sheer terror without it being sheer terror. Like very, very frightened, about to go live on international TV. The first time I was ever being interviewed in my life. And I was getting that reaction that you get, like, you know, when you see your own blood or you're like having an injection going, you know what I mean? It's like, right. And I said to myself, Demetri, you have a brain tumor and you could die soon. And that alleviated my fear. It put it all in context. And that internal monologue, that reference point, served me for the rest of my life up until my brain surgery. So that even when I went back to, because this was in Athens when I was interviewed internationally, I had gone to Athens for a wedding, and that's sort of how all of that cascaded, and I got on TV. And I said yes to every opportunity. I ran into danger. And I felt fear, but it was a mix of fear and adrenaline. And it didn't feel the way it used to feel. It wasn't, it didn't immobilize me. And then when I got to Washington, D.C., at that point, I don't know if I definitely felt probably some amount of fear, some amount of, I don't know though if I felt doubt. I think I got to such a place where I was manifesting the life I wanted in a way that I never had before. And I had just developed this confidence. And again, you know, it's not a huge part of my life anymore, but the context of facing mortality every day with something that's inside of your head, which could end your life and end your ability to create at any moment, it changes your sense of danger. And because this is the thing that scares you, it's this tumor. So everything else outside of that isn't really scary, and no one else really scares you, you know? And everything is really a test. It's a way to prove to yourself that you're okay. And so that's kind of what ended up happening. Yeah. Everything was an opportunity for me to show myself that I still had it in the gym, at work, everywhere. It was an opportunity to test myself. So yeah, I would say that I think that by the time I was in DC, I don't know that I really felt fear as much as I felt just this constant adrenaline to perform.
Yeah. Yeah. But then when you come back into this business, obviously you're kind of starting again, and you've got to kind of semi-reinvent yourself. So how do you go about doing that? What was it that drove you to create Hidden Forces? What was the original idea behind it?
Well, as I said, after I had my surgery in 2013, and I lost any interest in doing financial content, and Capital Account was a financial program. It was a global macro focused show on markets that was born out of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And of which we'll eventually get into in this conversation, because we're living in the aftermath of those policy decisions. But I didn't have any interest in going back there. And also, Capital Account was such an ideological program. I had a very simplistic template for understanding the world, and I stuck to that. And because it was a daily news program, I had to really just every day I would go and say, okay, how are central banks destroying the world today, guys? Let's find the story that tells us how they're destroying the world.
Right.
How is the government evil?
We've all been there.
Yeah. So I didn't want to do that, and because I was in a much more inquisitive frame of mind. But I didn't, I just felt there was a kind of, there was an apathy for that type of stuff, for intellectual pursuits, because I was much more driven to explore the spiritual, emotional dimensions of what I had just been through. And so I tried to do that. I really did. And I began working in the nonprofit space on a series of institutes, one of which had to do with death and dying for a nonprofit. I put on a conference on the subject. It was an amazing experience, but the field of competition was not my pace. I was too energetic, too amped up, too aggressive for the nonprofit world. It just wasn't for me, and I wasn't for them. We'll be clear about that. And then eventually I started a theater company, and that was sort of for two reasons. Because actually, before I started the theater company, between when I was at the nonprofit, in order to feed this internal, this desire, this inquisitiveness, I began going to New York City meetups, machine learning, Internet of Things, do-it-yourself IoT stuff, virtual reality, blockchain, and just to sort of get it back in touch with tech, because I began my career in tech. I began my career in the video game industry and in the application development and design UI side of television. That's how I got into my work into finance or into TV. So I started so I was doing that. I was going to these meetups, and I was discovering that every time people asked me what I did, because they'd be like, oh, you have such interesting takes, what do you do? And it was really hard to tell people what I did, because I felt like what I did wasn't really representative, and I ended up telling them about what I used to do, because I felt like what I used to do was who I was, but that doesn't really work. So this opportunity it came. You get opportunities in life, and you either say yes to them or you say no to them. And if there's one just basic piece of advice that I would tell people is just say yes. If something scares you, say yes. That's an indicator that it's for you, Yeah. And so I had this opportunity to produce my first off-Broadway theatrical production, to take full control of it, kind of similarly to how I did with Capital Account. And I took it, and I created a theater company, and I put on 3 subsequent productions. And that experience it served two purposes. One, it gave me something that I could say that I did that was interesting.
Right.
And it was very interesting to be in a group of tech people and say, I have a theater company. And it was a really cool theater company. So it was this way of sort of getting my foot in the door, a really expensive, ridiculous way to make an impression amongst a bunch of nerds. But it also gave me the opportunity to get in touch to be with people whose passions were aligned with what they were doing. Actors.
Sure.
And to be around that silliness and excitement and energy and passion was infectious. And so it was those two things. And out of that experience came the inspiration to write my story of what I had been through with my brain tumor, which I published for Quartz, the Atlantic's Quartz magazine, in the fall of 2015. And out of that began to brew the source of Hidden Forces. And in the summer of, or maybe it was in the summer of 2016 that I wrote the article, but it was in the summer of 2016 that I got the idea for Hidden Forces. And from that moment, once I had it in me, and it started with my rekindling my love for technology and science. And that's in the show when it began. I mean, there were episodes on philosophical mathematics, anarchism, cyber warfare, space war was episode 6.
Yeah.
So, but in any case, I started it in February of 2017, and ever since then, I've just enjoyed every minute of it. I've loved it.
But what was the framework originally? What did you set out to create? Because as a long time and avid listener, it's morphed and changed so much over those 4 years. What did you set out to create? And once you'd done that, how did it drift? Because I know you well enough to know nothing's accidental. You don't accidentally do anything. You think everything through, and you make very clear decisions about what you want to do. So just run me through that journey, because I'm interested.
Yeah, I think I looked back actively, deliberately at what it was that I loved so much about Capital Account, because the struggle was that I loved my time and my experience there, and I kept calling the people that I had great relationships with there. And I kept running into this similar experience, which was that my recollection of that time and my love for it was at odds with their own experience. They were happy to be past that phase, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I wasn't. And I was like, well, why am I so stuck on this experience that at the same time I don't want to go back to? Because everyone kept telling me, Demetri, why are you not doing something again that's financial? You were so good at it. And I couldn't answer that question. And so I started to ask it, what was it about markets that I loved so much? And the sort of basic explanation I came to was that I loved markets were the most complicated data set that I knew of. And what I loved about them was that they were this unsolvable problem, this unsolvable puzzle. And people were always trying to figure out what's driving the market. And I was always trying to figure out what's driving the market, what's really responsible for what's happening here. And I realized that same question was what fueled me my entire life. It began when I was a kid trying to understand what happens when I die. And it fueled every single question that I nagged my parents with, and everything else. I always wanted to know what's really driving this. Can we get deeper? Can we get deeper here? And philosophically, it was an ontological question about the nature of reality, which was something that always concerned me. And so that's where this idea of Hidden Forces came from. It was like, okay, can I apply that template and that love across all these different disciplines? Can I apply that same rubric? And the idea with Hidden Forces was, I keep going back to Capital Account.
Yeah, I know.
It's crazy, right? The idea of Hidden Forces was to try and understand the elemental truths about whatever it was that interested me, and also to get a seat at the table again. I mean, like I said, I missed being part of the conversation. I saw all these different folks still out there engaging on Twitter, having what felt like important conversations about issues that were happening out in the world. And I was tired of being a passive observer. I wanted to engage. And that's where it came from. But it has evolved. I mean, it began as a much more inquisitive pursuit where I was very uncomfortable expressing a strong view, although there was a strong amount of it. There was a great deal of insecurity in me at the time when I began it, and so what may have seemed like an opinion at the time in various circumstances was me just trying to come across as smart or wanting people to like me, But now it has gotten to a point now where I do feel a sense of responsibility and a role to play in a time, and you and I have talked about this before. We were talking about it just now before we turn on the microphone, which is that I think that we are living during what I believe will be the most important time of my life. In 50 years from now, 30 years from now, I don't expect my life to have as much meaning as it has now. And when I say not necessarily my personal life, but the role that I have to play in the world.
Yeah.
Because I think the world itself is at a critical juncture the kind of juncture that you get every 100 years or so.
I absolutely agree with that so strongly. And that's, it's so interesting to me that the contrast between your understanding of how important times are and something that I really want to talk to you about, and that is almost a throwaway remark you made about a year ago, right before lockdown started, when Ben Hunt and I both came into the studio in New York and sat down for a conversation. And you talked about this idea of financial nihilism. And it kind of hit me at the time, but it was kind of a slap around the cheek at the time. And I thought about it, and it kind of went away, but never really completely went away. And it's been kind of bouncing around the back of my head ever since. This is what, almost 2 years now, probably. No, year and change. And in the last 6 months, it's just forced its way to the front of my head, because I see so much going on that paints that picture that you distilled down into 2 words. But it's so much more than that. And I think it's so much more important than that, because when you talk about your life's never going to be more important than it is now, I think that's correct. But what I see happening is exactly what you described in those 2 beautifully chosen words. And so I've been dying to get you to kind of expand on that for some time now. So let's talk about that idea of financial nihilism and where you first saw it and how you came to kind of conceptualize that idea and what it means to you.
Yeah, well, I define market nihilism as a philosophy that treats the objects of speculation as though they were intrinsically worthless. And it doesn't just discount empirical truth or ignore objective reality. It fully embraces the view that reality is entirely subjective. And it incorporates that into an investing framework where value is no longer determined or ascertained through some objective measurement existing independent of price. But it is in fact price. In other words, the price of the token or the ticker is the thing.
Yeah.
And so that idea just came to me from watching markets repeatedly seem to discount anything related to the world, related to news, and just cease functioning as though reality mattered, as though there was a relationship, regardless how tenuous, between the world and prices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. But it might begin like that. But what's happened since then makes that phrase so much more accurate and so much more powerful, because we've not only seen that idea that things don't matter anymore in the abstract sense, i.e., this bomb attack here doesn't move the markets, and this particular comment by a politician hasn't moved the markets. That stuff doesn't matter. But what we've seen since then, with the rise of, the Wall Street bets crowd, the Reddit crowd, with cryptos, with so many different things, is real nihilism. It's like, I don't matter, life doesn't matter, my money doesn't matter, nothing matters except being involved in this, whatever it is, whatever meme is current at the moment. I kind of get that in a way, but I really struggle to think that it's either a good thing for the individual or society, and I really wonder where it leads. So how have you watched this financial nihilism evolve and change over the last 18 months?
That's a good question, because I do think that you can't separate what's going on in markets from what's going on in society.
No, absolutely right.
I do look at 2008 as a watershed moment, because I think in some ways what happened in 2008 through a set of deliberate policy choices is that moment of clarity that comes every so often in business cycles and in life was suspended. And with that, you had a suspension, you had a stasis that occurred in society where an entire generation of people, and I think this is also not coincidental, that you tend to find this kind of nihilistic approach to investing and to life among a particular group of people, a certain generation, I think a lot of millennials and now Zoomers have been kind of disenfranchised and locked out of the economic game, so to speak. And I think that, I mean, that plays one of the jokes I make is that the boomers had sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that millennials have Bitcoin. You know, and I think that there's something about that, because hearing my generation and younger people talk about Bitcoin or talk about stonks feels very empty. It feels very meaningless. It doesn't really feel like it doesn't really feel like there's something bigger.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But again, when you've come from a background of finance, and I've come from a background of finance, and maybe I'm too invested, and I think it means too much. That's quite possible. But what I see with things like the Hertz debacle, for example, right? That's a perfect example, right? When we watch that going on, anyone that has had a history in finance and spent any time in the game, anybody watching that, you could see that this was utterly futile, what was going on. And yes, while the stock went up, you know, in the middle of bankruptcy and with no recovery, it was clearly worthless. Some people made some money, but the people who were trying to make the real money, were trying to swing for the fences and make, you know, life-changing home runs there, you knew that was not going to work out for them. You knew that what they were trying to do was not going to pay off personally, but was going to help the people who understood the game to make returns. They never either make returns or save themselves losses that they were convinced they were going to have to take. And so, you know, when you watch this stuff, this nihilism, this I don't care if I lose, it was at one point crystallized into I want to stick it to the suits. And I really struggle with it, because I get the kind of motivations and the feeling of inequality and the feeling of hopelessness and that kind of thing. But the thing that I guess I really struggle with is how it has been turned into a game. All of it. It's just a game. And this is a game with real world consequences. And I don't know that people fully understand it, or maybe they do, and they really don't care.
Now, to be clear, I should add that, at the end of Hertz, with the used car market exploding and the final bid out of bankruptcy, some people did actually make some money on that, right? But you can guarantee it wasn't many of the retail investors who got swung around. Most of the gains went to, the suits. But look, what do you make of this whole phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. First, I feel that, I'm trying to intuit what the zeitgeist is and what people are feeling. And it's not obviously something that I can quantify or measure in any sort of empirical way. But I think part of it is that people seem to feel a lack of liveliness. There's a desire to feel alive. And what may come across as masochism, and maybe it is, when you see these people on Reddit threads posting screenshots of their wrecked Robinhood accounts. Yeah, I think that part of that is about feeling something, because maybe they graduated in 2008 or 2009 and never really got a job and kind of have been floating around, and they're 30 years old now, or 32, or they don't have a girlfriend, or there's a huge percentage of the population that is in some way within that cohort. And it impacts politics as well. It's, I think, part of the reason that our politics is so unstable, because a lot of the volatility that was taken out of financial markets by policymakers has shown up as discontented masses in politics. But I think that I don't know exactly. I wish I could tell you what I think is going on, other than to say that there's rot, there's a kind of societal decay. And also I think technology plays a role. I think that there's a lot of people are with automation also, a lot of stuff just gets done and people don't have to think about it. And part of that, people I think partly approach markets that way because markets have become increasingly automated, whether it is through systematic investing strategies or policymakers who create the false assurances that everything will return to normal, that equilibrium is markets slowly going up, and that you don't need to actually play an active role as an investor in the process of price discovery and valuations. That's not something that people seem to think about anymore. It's all about narrative. And that narrative can be very empty. It's only skin deep. You know, I did an episode with Lily Frankus where we talked about this in the case of GameStop, and it was really, and it's not the only time I've done this. I did a recent episode actually on Ethereum and a thesis that someone had put forward for why its price was going to increase by like over 10x or 30x. And none of these explanations actually deal with, I would argue, really fundamental reality the way that you and I would think about it. It's really, in some ways, it's an advanced meta conception of the world, which is that the reality is what everyone else thinks it is. And so if I want to make money, I simply have to try and get ahead of the curve of what that narrative is going to be. And what's dangerous is that in such a world, you can actually co-create reality. You can play a role in shaping that reality. And that, again, there are a lot of parallel constructions here that has a lot in common with how social media algorithms work. They give you more of what you want. They construct your world based on your existing biases. And there is a level of stagnation there, of stasis, which is that eventually when the algorithms become perfected, they give you a static world. They give you the representation that you came to the system with, and they throw it right back at you. And in a way, that is, for me, what 2008 was about. It was the beginning of the end of that catalytic process of boom and bust, where we moved from a capitalist system. You're never a perfect capitalist system, right? Or anything, but we moved much more along the continuum of socialism. And I think that we've had a hard time really voicing that, giving that a name, because we say that we live in a capitalist system. There are prices in the market. You have to still buy things, but it's not the way that we would have conceptualized what capitalism was.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I have, one thing I've thought about, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, because I grew up in the UK, and so for my entire life, gambling has been legal and everywhere. You know, even as a kid, every year my dad would put a bet on a horse in the Grand National for me. He'd put £1. I'd pick a horse's name out, and he'd put £1 on the horse. So gambling was always available. I've never been someone that was a gambler. You know, I got enough of that in my job for 30 odd years. But this all seems to be happening just as gambling is becoming much more easily available in the United States. Does that play a part that people who haven't had any experience of that it's new to them and it's exciting and it does give them an escape? Does gambling play a big part in this, do you think?
Totally. I think that markets have become more like casinos.
Yeah, exactly right.
And this is a phenomenon that I talked about in my time in TV with Capital Account, which is that savers were becoming speculators. Because in a world where money is free and it becomes harder to have an effect as an investor by applying a critical thinking framework to analyzing the value of something and attempting to purchase it at a price that is below value, as that becomes more difficult, then what is there really? Then chance plays a bigger and bigger role in outcomes. And so your investment strategy begins to actually reflect that. And so I think that it's not a coincidence that we see that, and that we see it in markets as well, that there is this kind of, let's just YOLO. You only live once. I'm just going to throw my stimulus check into the market and just hopefully make a large return. And I think also, Grant, part of the explanation is also the fact that returns don't mean much anymore unless they're big. Right. Everything needs to be enormous.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't make a dent. It doesn't make a dent in your debt. It doesn't make a dent in house payments. It doesn't really matter. And on top of that, money is, at the same time as it's more difficult to attain than it ever was, it also seems to matter more than it did at any time in my life. People are, I mean, if you scroll through social media, the amount of images that have people, whether they're taking a fake photo shoot in an airplane, in a private jet, or they're, walking around with their selfie sticks, whatever people use today to take pictures of themselves, or putting filters on their images. There's this artificial construction of reality, and a lot of that has to do with money and this unattainable amount of wealth. So I feel like that is a big part of what drives people to treat money, and also the fact that money has become free, and that we've confused capital with credit in the years since the financial crisis.
I mean, if you think about gambling at the casino, anyone that goes into the casino knows that the house has the edge, right? But they think that they're going to be the guy who walks away with the big ticket. But what's amazed me for short periods of time over the last year is that you would think going into the stock market, if you liken it to a casino, that the house, and by the house I mean incumbent professional investors would have a way bigger edge than the house of a casino. And yet, what's been interesting is for short periods of time, the guys running in and screaming around the tables of the stock market have managed actually to take away that edge and to create currents and cross currents in markets that have completely and utterly obliterated strategies and investment styles and techniques that have worked for centuries. Yeah. So there has been a degree of success in terms of people kind of storming the barricades and coming out winners. But as I look at it, the more and more people that sucks in, the more difficult it then becomes to be the kind of crazy one at the table making all the stupid bets that happens to get lucky every now and again. Do you see this trend continuing, or is this a case of, once again, sucking in the maximum number of retail investors before the whole thing comes tumbling down about their ears, and the people that walk away with the really big gains are the guys who've been doing this for a living for 25 years?
Well, I guess there is a way for it to continue, and that is if we become increasingly socialistic or communistic and totalitarian, because that would be a kind of a new equilibrium, right? Where we would just have to stop pretending that we're a capitalist society and a free society. And there are a lot of people that want to move us in that direction.
Yeah.
And a lot of those conversations happen around geopolitical comparisons to China, and conversations about which model of society and politics and polity is better. Is it the sort of Western liberal democratic version, or is it something that's more akin to Singapore in a benign version, or a more malign version in the form of China? I think, just to kind of make an observation, I think that if you think about it as an ecosystem or as like a solar system, it's like a large gravitational body has entered our solar system, and it has affected everything in the system. And the problem is, where if you think about it as an ecosystem, it's like the predators, the value investors, have become increasingly emancipated and have died off. So if we are to return to something like we used to have, that's going to come with an adjustment that's so painful that it's difficult to imagine. And it's why our political system is so unstable, because our political system is predicated on some level of mobility and equality, and that exists at a less amount than anything that I had in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's almost non-existent now, and that does bring us nicely onto politics and this idea of inequality being a driving force for a lot of this change, because the inequality is getting more and more noticeable to everybody, it seems, except the Federal Reserve. When you see these guys come out and say that we absolutely don't see any linkage between monetary policy and rising inequality, there are a lot of things that I give central bankers a hard time for, but that to me is absolutely egregious, because there is zero chance that that's anything but a lie. And so, when you look at that and the role that central banks have played, you said this started in 2008. Their role has changed and gotten bigger, and their grip on markets has necessarily gotten tighter over the years. How do you see their role now, and what effects on the outcome are they having with the decisions they're making right now, do you think?
I think that, I guess there are two interesting questions that come up. One is what role are they having now? Hopefully I'll remember to answer that. But you can remind me. And the first one is, well, now I forgot the first one. Sorry. This happens sometimes. So I guess I could just answer the second one then, the role that they play, which is, I think that they're trying to hold everything together. And I'm not sure to what degree they believe what they say. There is we all sort of, on some level, some of us more than others, lie to ourselves in order to justify our actions. But I don't know to what degree they are this fixed and wedded to their models of the economy and oblivious to what the rest of us experience, what the rest of us see. I mean, they live in the same world that you and I live in. Can't they see what's happening? Can't they see the same phenomena that we experience? Can't they listen to podcasts where people talk about it? So it is a bit confusing to me. It may also just be that they view the world as elites. They're part of an elite class of technocrats, and so they maybe believe that they know best. I don't know, but I do think that they are trying to hold it all together at this point. And I don't believe they actually have a long-term strategy. I don't think that that's how the incentives work for policymakers like them. So that would be I don't know if there's anything else to it. I think that's sort of the way they see their role. They're just holding it together.
But where does this lead? Where does this move towards financial nihilism ultimately lead? Because nihilism tends to lead to very dark places.
Yeah.
And the longer this goes on, to me, the darker it gets. And if we're looking at what's happened in crypto in the last few days, we're looking at what's happened in SPACs, we're looking at what's happened in things like ARK, and what we're seeing now is a whole raft of these things that have drawn these financial nihilists in like moths to a flame, starting to do what sadly these types of things do every cycle, and that is take the money of those who can least afford to lose it. So where does this financial nihilism lead? Because it could now have a much broader and much more dangerous effect in terms of social disorder and unrest if what looks like it's starting to happen continues.
Yeah, I think on some level we all kind of know deep down. I think there's a lot of anxiety in the culture, whether it's expressed in film or in other forms of artwork. People have always had sort of obsessions with the end of the world. But yeah. I do feel like that has grown and it has spilled over everywhere, whether it's in climate, whether it's in doomsday predictions around the economy. I think that we've been able to get this far because America has the global monetary standard. And we've been able to subsidize this ride and allow this to continue for an indefinite period of time. But I think that at some point, what's going to happen is, and we're closer. I don't know. No one knows, but I like you. I've sort of been stunned at the incompetence and the tone deafness of our leadership. Mm-hmm. I think that the international dimensions of the world today and the changing global order and the rise of China and the conflict between the United States and China and the increasing observation that the Chinese Communist Party and the government in China is really not interested in playing that game, in playing the game that we sought to institutionalize after the end of the Cold War, and which we've been so good at playing. At great cost, I would argue, also, to many people in the country. So my sense is that we just end up seeing America become increasingly authoritarian, and eventually there's either going to be a descent into totalitarianism, or we're going to get a leader who will use that power that he or she will have accumulated in order to reset or bring us back to something that more closely resembles the United States or the Western world that we're familiar with. The thing that's difficult is that no one knows what war or conflict of the sort that I think we feel is coming is going to look like in the 21st century. We know some of the weapons that are involved, but we don't really understand how all of those things come together. And more importantly, we don't understand how people will react in that type of situation, what kind of expectations people have, their ability to come together, their ability to be manipulated, all of those things, because we also live in this very different informational landscape where people have, I think, the more tenuous relationships with the world. Again, we talked about this in terms of nihilism and also markets with objective reality. They have less tenuous relationships with each other. And so that's the scariest part for me. It is how fragile we are as a society. And it has less to do with what other people can do to us. It's what we're doing to ourselves and what can be done to us with just a few pushes and a few pulls.
What kind of opportunity does this kind of Western financial nihilism offer up to China, for example? Because you've had some incredible interviews on Hidden Forces talking about China. The recent one with Josh Rogan was absolutely spellbinding. It's fantastic, and everyone listening to this should absolutely check that out. But you've obviously had a lot of conversations about China. So what kind of opportunity does this throw up for them? Because it does seem to be that. It does seem to be an opportunity.
It's taken me a long time to come to as clear a view on this dynamic as I have today. Because when I started down this road with the podcast, I had the same view of China that I had 10, 20 years before that, which was that this is a country that's moving from communism to capitalism, and that they're actually, more capitalistic than Americans. The kind of Jim Rogers view that the Chinese are, they're actually very capitalistic. And it took me some time to really understand how different China is and how different the Chinese Communist Party is, and the organs of government, and the brain, the way, the intelligence of that system and how it's organized versus what we have today. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party has very different motivations than, let's say, Western democracies. They're a fundamentally insecure organization. They're politically insecure because they don't have a popular mandate. And so the risks that they're willing to take in order to prevent internal dissent and internal instability are much greater than what we have here. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what worries me is that they're going to continue to be willing to escalate. And at some point, we are going to have to hold our ground. That's the way I see it. And whether that's going to be Taiwan, I know everyone keeps bringing up Taiwan now. I always think it's interesting when something becomes an almost consensus view among a particular class of individuals. But whether it's Taiwan or something else, because it's usually something else, it's never the thing that everyone is worried about, I do think that we're going to escalate into a crisis. And at that point, there's going to have to be a reevaluation on both sides about where we want to take it. And what concerns me in our case is that there doesn't really seem to be the kind of leadership in this country that would instill confidence, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and you don't really see any on the horizon. There isn't a sort of unifying government and strong leadership. I don't know if you feel that way, if you see that.
Yeah. No, I do see that, but unfortunately, I also see that here in the UK. I see it in other countries around the world. We're seeing, particularly what's going on in France at the moment with the military over there, seeing exactly the same thing, but actually signing petitions to that effect. And this in a country that has a habit and a history of these kind of military coup type situations.
Yeah.
So I think that's I think that's a great point, and it extends far beyond America. I don't think that's a particularly American-centric thing. But you mentioned the word crisis there, and the idea that this will end in a quote-unquote crisis, and that kind of brings me to another really strong factor in all this, and that's the media. You and I both set out to have honest conversations with people about what's going on without any kind of bias, apart from our own, personal biases, which we're both open about in those conversations. There's no kind of hidden agenda here. But the sensationalist nature of the media today makes a crisis something that 40 years ago wouldn't have been a crisis. It would have been a situation, right? But now it's a crisis. And, and I've been shocked as this era that we're talking about, and we're using this term financial nihilism as a kind of catch-all for all of it. But I've been shocked genuinely at just how biased the media is towards negative sensationalist headlines in the age of pay for clicks. What role do you see that playing, and how dangerous is the direction the media is currently traveling in terms of creating a real crisis out of something that wouldn't necessarily need to be one?
Yeah. So on some level, I wonder how different that is, because I feel like that sort of sensationalism has more or less always been a part of the news, a desire to make a story interesting or compelling.
Right, but didn't we used to have balanced? That I agree with you.
I think we had.
What's missing is the balance.
Yeah, I know what I think we had. I think that the people in the news in the 50s and 60s and 70s were more invested in the stability of the country than they are today. I think what you tend to see today, a great example is, and it's not just, I'm not going to just pick on Tucker Carlson, because I could find multiple other examples that align with him politically and examples on the other side of that equation. But when I listen to Tucker Carlson's program, I get anxious. I feel nervous about the future, also because it makes me nervous that he feeds that level of paranoia, but it actually gets into me. What he's saying makes me feel paranoid. It makes me question the world around me. And I think that the job of the news should be, and perhaps this is to your point, was to try and expose the truth, but to also recognize that, like, your platform, if it's very big, is powerful. And that if Walter Cronkite comes out and tells people that the president of the United States is actually trying to chemically castrate every American, I'm not saying Tucker Carlson said this, but
right.
The point is that information is powerful and credibility is powerful. So
but going back to those times, the nation, whether it be America with the Walter Cronkites of the world, or whether it be the UK with the David Frosts of the world, or other countries that had their own, there were certain journalists who were trusted, were balanced, were fair, and were respected. But there was a handful of them, and so they kind of stood out on their own. But now there are so many news anchors, political commentators. There's something for everyone, and of course they naturally, I guess, fracture left and right. They fracture, along a horizontal line rather than the vertical line, and that feels very dangerous, because whatever your pre-existing biases are, to that earlier point about social media, you can find a polemic commentator that's made just for you, right? And then you end back up in those echo chambers where that's where you get everything from.
Yeah, and you also have to wonder how much of this is, are we really comparing apples to oranges here? Because it's not like we have the same news landscape, the same media machine that we had in the 1950s or the 60s today. Today, a lot of what passes as news is actually ads. it's ad-driven content, or content that might be created by a news organization, but it's created under the incentives that are driven by a commercial operation in the form of a social media platform. And it does feel to me pretty clear now that this is the dominant force that's driving the kind of content that we see. And I mean, look, dude, this recent stuff with Elon Musk and Dogecoin and Bitcoin, I watched this stuff happening, and had this happened 10 years ago, I mean, what do you think would have been the result? How would news organizations have covered this, and how would people have responded?
I don't know that it would have necessarily been covered, right? Certainly not to the extent it is now. And that's testament to just how powerful social media is in making sure everyone knows about that story, because it's in everybody's Instagram feeds and everybody's Twitter feed. But it also enables, again, people to pick sides, right? It's, are you team Elon or are you team Bitcoin? And before that, it was, are you team Tesla or team Tesla Q? And before that, and then, but even within those communities, you've got, are you a Bitcoin maximalist or are you, one of those Ethereum jokers because Ethereum's not a real cryptocurrency? Yeah, there's just fracturing everywhere. Yeah. And so the fact that Elon Musk has managed to do what he's done with a few tweets over the last few days, frankly, shouldn't surprise anybody who's been watching him for the last couple of years. But by the same token, is any of it really news? Really?
Well, I guess right. So that speaks to something which is that I think that what would have been considered aberrant behavior, insanely aberrant behavior only a few years ago, quickly normalizes.
Yes, and but that comes down to consequences and lack of consequences.
Lack of consequences, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of, I think that feeds the nihilism, because there's a kind of sense that like, well, then nothing matters really. So why not just put all my life savings into this YOLO bet? Why not just, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. And then again, with in terms of news, there is a culture similarly, I think, among people in news organization, which is really, my coverage doesn't really matter. It's not going to really move the needle because, like you said, plenty of stories have been written up about Elon Musk, but why hasn't anything changed? And that's also, confusing to me. I don't really know entirely the reason for that. Do people care less also? And the less anything changes, the less they care, and the less they care, the less things change.
Maybe I would posit that perhaps it's precisely because there have been no consequences that, I mean, look, he's committed the single biggest act of securities fraud in history, right? And he cannot, by court order, deny that, which again is such a ridiculous outcome that, oh no, we're not going to prosecute you for securities fraud, but you can never deny that you did it, is such a cop-out on the part of regulators that, of course, it emboldens anybody to do that.
I think what I'm sort of touching on is that I think the struggle that a lot of journalists and good journalists that are trying to do good work are having is how to break through, how to educate people, so that if Elon comes into the crypto ecosystem and he pumps Bitcoin and all the Bitcoiners get excited and they jump on the bandwagon, then he basically comes out and says, actually, Bitcoin uses insane amounts of energy. This isn't consistent with my brand. I'm going to invest in Dogecoin and I'm just going to fix its transaction scaling problems. How do journalists find a way to communicate to the vast majority of people that may know nothing about the scaling limitations of public distributed ledger technology, of blockchains? How do they find a way to communicate that so that people get it? And they're like, oh, this is fraud. This is bullshit. This guy is a con artist.
But this is, I think this is part of the answer, but also part of the problem, is that what's happened, and as you know, I've watched with fascination the whole Musk thing unfold.
Yeah, totally.
Over the last few years, as you and we've spoken at this at length many, many times. But the common thread is that the scales don't fall from people's eyes until one of two things happens, particularly with regards to him. One, he wades into their swimming pool where, they know everything that's going on in that pool and makes some ridiculous pronouncement that people suddenly go, well, that's just either impossible or it's just complete nonsense. Then the scales fall from their eyes. Or, as it seems in the case of cryptocurrencies, something he says costs them money, right? And so if those are the only two things that can change your view of the man, what chance do journalists have to educate people? Because people don't care unless it costs them money or it directly contrasts with something that they already know to be true. So how can a journalist actually educate people? Because people reading a story about Elon Musk, 95% of them have made up their mind before they read that story. They either think he is everything he purports to be, in which case any critical article is not listened to or read properly. It's just derided and they pick apart every line. Or if they think that he's all the things that other people claim he is, it's just an echo chamber for them. I don't see in an age where celebrities can control their own narratives to such an extent and speak to their own audiences directly and foster that audience. I don't see how journalism really works in those cases until that person or that organization actually makes a mistake and exposes themselves accidentally en masse to everybody. And at that point, the journalist can step in and say, well, this has been coming for a while and here's what you missed, kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder also if we've moved from an age where people were educated they had a systemic or a systematic way of thinking through problems, empirical models in their head for judging reality that they could apply independently of authority figures, to a world where people really depend on what someone they trust says in order to determine what's true or not. So in the case of Elon, if he went on Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan called his bluff, if Joe Rogan went from being a believer to being someone who said, you know what, this guy's a con artist, you can't believe him, and he made a point to show that to people, would that be how you reach people today? Because
maybe
people don't have.
Sorry to interrupt, but maybe that is how you reach them. But are those people just going along with Joe Rogan? Are they really seeing?
That's exactly right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So that's the point. So if it feels like people have lost their ability to think critically, to arrive at critical judgments independently. And I don't know if you feel this too, because I kind of feel it also. You kind of question whether the world that you used to live in was the way that you thought it was, or maybe it was just your imagination, Like I grew up, I was born in the very early 1980s, and I graduated high school in 2000. My memory of what life was like in the 90s feels like that couldn't have been real life.
Right.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah, and look, and for me, my equivalent period would be the 80s, which is a lot further ago. And, for something that was 10 years earlier, it was 50 years earlier in terms of progress.
Right.
So I totally get that. But I
would just say this. Sorry, I want to say this too, though. I didn't feel that way in 2008. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I didn't feel in 2008 that the 1980s, which would have been the equivalent period of time, was somehow not real or unbelievable or hard. Something feels fundamentally different in the last 10 years. Something has changed so that the world no longer feels as tangible or substantive as it used to feel for my entire life.
Well, look, I've thought about this a lot, and I agree with that. And all I can come up with when I think that problem through, the answer I get just makes me question myself rather than anything else, because I come back to this idea of, if you make money no longer real, you essentially make nothing real, because in the world we live in, everything, realistically speaking, has a value. And so but I hate to be that finance guy that puts everything on to central banks and monetary policy, because it seems like such an easy cop out for someone in finance. But the more I think about it, and my daughter's in the process of buying her first house, and so you look at the world through the eyes of a 30-year-old with two very young kids who's buying their first house, is very excited about it, and you look at the reality of what they're going through, and it is all predicated upon zero cost of capital, all of it. Their entire lives basically are predicated upon that continuing. And if that doesn't continue, their world will change for the worse in ways that they can't possibly fathom right now, but I can. But I often wonder whether it's because I've been immersed in this world of finance, and that's where I see the fault lines. Maybe it's inevitable.
I know. I think that's a huge part of it, and we've talked about that in this conversation. But, I can't help but think that it's actually, in some ways, the explanation is simpler, which is that our existence has become increasingly intermediated through multiple layers of technology. You and I are sitting here on what would have been considered science fiction in the 90s. This is like when you watched Space Odyssey 2001 and they were on like a telescreen, right? Or like the Jetsons or whatever. But this is how increasingly we live our lives. I'm in touch with so many people, and I'm inundated with so much information, but only a very small amount of that is analog. Only a very small amount of that is in the physical world, touching people, speaking with them, having those relationships. And a lot of times, what I also tend to find is that things that we experience through intermediation feel less real. We're less sure. I was speaking with Grant yesterday. Was I speaking with him? Because I was texting with him. Was I texting with him? Was I DMing him on Twitter? Was it through LinkedIn we were talking? Did I get an email? I can't quite remember. And I think maybe, and this, to bring it back to my experience of my brain tumor and dementia, maybe this is a bias from that experience, or maybe actually it's informed by what I went through and something that I know that very few people realize, which is that memory is very ephemeral. And it's very easy to doubt what you think you know. And it feels like we're living in an age where people's doubt in, you name it, whatever it is, has increased. And that might just be because, or a big part of that might be because of how we experience the world today. And that isn't conducive to forming sturdy memories or sturdy convictions about things, because things can change so easily. You read an article, someone can just edit it, take it out. It's not a newspaper, it's not something you have in your hands. And so maybe our brains weren't evolved to live in this kind of a world. And that this explains a big part of what's happening to the psyche, to the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible. And I wonder how it plays out from here, because at the end of the day, you come back to this fact that mankind has progressed essentially nonstop. There have been, in the scheme of our historical timelines, very short periods where there's been, regression, but there's never been technological regression. There's been societal regression, but it tends to constantly move forward, which makes you wonder how this particular period transitions into the next, whether we do regress for a brief period of time and then move forward. And, part of this podcast series that Fleck and I have been doing about the end game is really, it's not about an end game at all. It's just about a transition that how do we get from here to whatever comes next? So stripping the finance out of it, how do we get, do you think, from here to whatever comes next from a societal point of view?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Before I do, I should say another thing that came up for me when we were discussing the sort of ephemeral nature of the world today is that I don't think it's a coincidence that things like Bitcoin and distributed ledger technologies have become so popular and captured the imagination of so many people, and that the words that you hear to describe them are often things like truth machine. Because I think people are trying to find something that's real in this digital world, something that doesn't change, something that gives them confidence. So to answer your question, I think you asked how do we transition?
Yeah, the transition. Yeah,
Yeah. In terms of like the way we experience the world, because we talked about transition in geopolitical terms and political terms, but
just us as a society, when you talk, because I think you're right, we're more connected and yet more isolated than we've ever been. So how does that resolve itself? Because they don't make for easy bedfellows, those two ideas.
That's a really great question. I mean, some people will tell you that we just evolve, and that's the process that we're currently in, that humanity is evolving. And the people that are just more naturally acclimated to this world that we're moving into are going to be the ones that thrive in it. And let's say people that would have done better in a world where maybe they're really good in a room or they're really good public speakers, maybe those people struggle. I don't know. I wish I had an easy answer. I do think that there's going to be a lot of, if I had to guess, like for me, what I saw, and this is a political, it brings in political elements to your answer. The invasion of the Capitol in early January was for me a really dark and emblematic moment. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that internally there are people that still live in a different world. I mean, there are many more worlds that we all live in, and we're all sort of living in the same digital world. Granted, we have different experiences of it, but we all can occupy that space. But the physical world still does matter. If I had to guess, I mean, I always feel a little uncomfortable doing this, but if I had to guess, I think there's a rising likelihood that we'll see political terrorism in the United States, homegrown violence. I think that countries like Russia, or the governments of Russia, their intelligence agencies, and China will exploit that in the same way that our intelligence agencies have exploited it. I think the battle lines will become increasingly difficult to discern. It'll become harder to understand who is your friend and who is your enemy, whether that's within the country or without. And I guess when you put it that way, Grant, it makes it feel like we have a much longer way to go, mm-hmm. because we do struggle to determine what's real and what's not real.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's why people like me who've grown up in a real world and value that real world immensely. That's, I think, why we struggle to embrace fully the virtual world. And it also, to me, explains why the people who are digital natives and absolutely embrace the virtual world struggle to embrace the real world. And that you can only see that going one way, because dinosaurs, I'm using air quotes, like me, are going to be gone long before the digital natives do. And so maybe the world is on a one-way ride away from the real and towards the virtual.
Well, so that makes me think of something, which is that maybe you're technically Gen X. Is that what your demographic is?
Yeah.
So maybe your generation and the previous generation really don't see the world the way I do. Like maybe when I talk about the confusion that I feel around my recollection of what my life used to be like versus what it's like today, maybe that's something that's more common. First of all, maybe it's just me. Maybe it's more.
I don't think so.
Oh, maybe it's more common with millennials who kind of were right in that middle period between the analog and the digital. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's less of an issue for digital natives, for people that grew up with mobile technologies and hyper-connected internet. And maybe that's what this all is. It's the sort of tension of transition from one way of living, one view of the world, to another. And at some point, those of us that are around that maybe don't feel comfortable with it have to somehow just become acclimated to it. I don't know. But it does make one nervous when you think about the fact that we are flesh and blood. And human beings, can die in explosions, to bring it back to the point about political terrorism. And so are we equipped to manage nuclear arsenals or, cars that drive at 80 miles an hour? Are we equipped to live in a world where there are physical dangers that are everywhere, while at the same time being so kind of checked out? I mean, Mike Green and I talked about this in an episode that we did together when we were talking about passive investing, which is this sort of checked out, set it, forget it type of thing. And we see this everywhere with automation, that people become increasingly just acclimated to this idea that someone else will solve the problem.
Delegation.
Delegating it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And look, the interesting thing is that man has always evolved and pushed the boundaries and pushed the barriers, but realistically speaking, most of that, with the exception of medical science, obviously, most of that technological breakthroughs have been to make his life easier and to be able to have to do less work and to have the luxury of being lazier. That's what we've tried to do. And so when you keep pushing that way, how do I make my life easier? How do I make things more convenient, less hard work? Then the direction of travel is fairly obvious.
Yeah, something else that I thought about along those lines recently was that automation in the U.S., it presents a political problem because it makes people increasingly useless. And in a representative democracy, people have political value, institutionally speaking, even if they don't have economic value. Whereas in a country like China, in some ways, automation is a political opportunity to solve a problem of illegitimacy in the nature of the system. And I do that, again, to bring it back to the geopolitical dimensions. I worry about, and I did an episode with Chris Brose about the future of warfare. He was staff director for the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he also was, or maybe he was staff director for John McCain, and he was whatever the other term is. And we were talking about the future of warfare and the fact that him and others like him, and Josh Wolf, I think, will make the same argument. They feel that we have to invest in these technologies. We have to invest in autonomous weapons of different sorts because it's just the game theory. That's what our adversaries are doing. But you do wonder, and you look back at films that obviously, they might have seemed alarmist in the 1990s, a movie like Terminator. But you look back now and you're like, I mean, is that just where we're going? And it's a really, no one wants to live their life that way. So we all kind of just say, nah, whatever, maybe we are, but you know what? I have my kids and they're really amazing. Or, it's a beautiful day outside. I'm just going to go take a walk. And you go and just kind of forget it. And maybe that's just a limitation of how human beings live, like what we are able to do. And maybe we weren't meant to have this kind of power. I think about that a lot, like, is there knowledge that is too dangerous for humanity to have? Was the splitting of the atom an example of that? Was that an example of something that we would have been better off not knowing and not exploiting? And is there power that is too great in the hands of a species that evolved from a highly aggressive and is a highly aggressive animal? And I if I had to guess, I'd say the answer is yes to that. And I do worry about I do worry about the forces that are going to be increasingly weighing down the likelihood of our survival. And which is why I did an episode also with Toby Ord on existential risks. And if I remember correctly in his book, he did sort of take the view that if we can get through the 21st century, then our chances of surviving in the next century are greatly increased. Because whatever it is that we've got to figure out, we've got to figure it out in this century. And it does feel like that to me. Yeah. And I don't know, I don't know if you've been following all this UFO stuff. I also it's an interesting time to have all this come at you because all the news media is telling you that the Pentagon and the government is releasing conclusive footage that's basically conclusive in the sense that we have no clue what this is. It's not our shit. These aren't our spacecraft. And they're moving at speeds and conducting maneuvers that would kill a normal person. And then they're diving into the water and disappearing. And you're just kind of like, wait, how do I wrap my head around this? What are you telling me? And where does this fit in all of that?
Isn't that interesting? Because my instant reaction to that is, why are you telling me this now? right? If this has been classified for 50
Ben Hunt
years,
thing.
yeah,
Why am I hearing
absolutely
about
right. Yeah, why this? Why now? But
why do you
with something
think?
like that, which has been the source of great conjecture for 60, 70 years, why are you suddenly declassifying this stuff and putting this stuff out there so that people have suddenly got something to think about that isn't anything we've spoken about over this last hour and change? And I can't help but think that's a very deliberate, look at, as the old Eddie Izzard line, look, over there, a badger with a gun. Yeah, it's that kind of thing, right? It's a high-tech bread and circuses is what it is.
Yeah, so do you think it is it's a concoction? There's no there.
I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But I certainly, I mean, I haven't been following it, but I certainly wouldn't read a story like that and go, oh, wow, there's UFOs out there, right? I'd be thinking, well, hang on a second. Hold on. Hang on a second. Like, it just, that's my instant reaction to that, because I say I haven't been following the story. And I just think it's really weird that you would come out with this now.
Yeah.
Listen, before we wrap this up, Demetri, I want to talk to you about cryptocurrencies, and I don't do this a lot, but I'm interested in your views on them simply because I know that you're very thoughtful about these things. I see you post a whole bunch of skeptical comments on Twitter, but I also see you post constructive pieces, and you've done some fascinating interviews with people in the crypto community. So just, I'm interested in your personal journey in crypto, because I know it actually started quite some years ago. How's that unfolded for you, and where are you now with the whole thing?
Yeah, so I mean, I developed some familiarity with blockchain databases and blockchain technology in 2012 and 2013 through Bitcoin, but I didn't really get into it until 2017. And what interested me, where I focused my attention on, was understanding the scaling problem, the challenges to scaling Bitcoin and to scaling Ethereum, and what I learned from that process. And in the time being, I've come to view blockchain, so to speak, writ large, DLT, distributed ledger technologies.
Right.
A lot of what we've been seeing in the space, what I didn't, for example, appreciate with Bitcoin, because what I came to the view in 2017 that Bitcoin just couldn't scale, and that therefore it would never really be money, and that it would have to be something else that would take its place. And what I didn't appreciate then was that, and this is my view, some people may not agree with it, it's that Bitcoin was never really about money. It was never really about solving the problem of banking or money. It wasn't even necessarily about the fairness issue around how money is distributed. At its core, I think it's about the wealth gap. And it is a private sector mechanism for redistributing wealth in the face of the inequities caused by public policy in the fallout of 2008. I think that ultimately has been the driver for Bitcoin, because if you look at how the Bitcoin community faces problems, challenges to Bitcoin, whether it's energy usage, whether it's scaling issues, their response to that is to fight everything head on, to ensure that nothing affects the value, that the value of Bitcoin continues to rise, because the price is what matters. It isn't actually about making the technology better. That's my view. And of course, there's a desire to increase the technology, but only insofar as it increases the price. And if you listen to those conversations, they're very sensitive to how changes will impact people's desire to hold Bitcoin, because acquiring and holding Bitcoin is what gives it its price. So I think that a huge part of what has been driving this space, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's DeFi, and a lot of the tokens, the ERC20 tokens built on Ethereum, are the same Ponzi dynamics that drive equity markets, and the same kind of market nihilism, or what Tony Greer, our mutual friend Tony Greer, would call post-modernism in markets. It's really just a wealth redistribution mechanism. It's part of the same zero-sum dynamics that informs so much of the speculation that happens in equity markets.
Yeah, that's actually really well put. Well, look, mate, before we finish, we began with you and your personal journey, and I want to wrap up by asking you what's next for Hidden Forces. What are your plans for it? What do you want to do with it? Where's it going to go from here? Because I've watched it evolve, and it's been fascinating to watch, and it just gets better and better. So what do you want to do with it from here?
Well, I enjoy doing the show so much that sometimes it gets in the way of what some other people in my life tell me I should be doing. Because I get so much value from actually speaking to so many people and advancing my own sort of understanding of the world. First and foremost, for me, we've started this conversation, I said, when it began, it was this platform for inquiry and self-development, but it's become a way to help people gain the tools that they need to understand the world better, to understand the systems of power that structure the world around them, and to think critically, because this is a problem that we talked about, of course, during the course of the conversation, that people have a hard time thinking critically. They have a hard time coming to a determination about what is true and what is not with an independent framework that it's not dependent on an authority figure, for example. And for me, it's an educational platform. To the extent that I can use this to advance people's knowledge and to also do it from a place of, you and I share some values. We have there's certain things that we think are aligned with personal integrity. We see a lot of stuff in the world today that we don't agree with, whether it's in financial markets, whether it's in politics, with our discourse. And so for me, Hidden Forces is a platform to have civilized conversations from a good faith conversations where I and my guests try and think through problems that other people are facing. And it's just especially relevant and meaningful at a time where the world is changing so rapidly that people's primary and secondary and college and even master's degrees quickly become less relevant than they would have in the past. And they need to constantly update their knowledge of the world. And there's really no great place to become educated to where you can, so I think that's sort of how I see the platform.
Well, listen, mate, I've enjoyed that journey so far, and I will be a keen supporter of whatever you decide to do next. But there will be people out there listening to this that haven't tuned in yet and aren't familiar with it. So just give yourself a plug and let people understand how to find you and all that good stuff on Twitter and the website.
Yeah, so you can basically go through the entire Hidden Forces library of all the previous episodes I've done. You can do that on any podcast platform, but the best way to do it is to do it through our website at hiddenforces.io, because you can actually scroll through. They have pictures of all the guests, and you can also open up each episode page and look through the rundowns, which are the notes that I create ahead of every episode, the transcripts, and the overtimes. Because like you, I've never taken sponsors for my show. It's always been a subscription-driven model, and that's part of, again, my desire to put the content first. That's how I would say. You could also follow me on Twitter at Kofinas and Hidden Forces at Hidden Forces Pod. And that's what I would say. If I'm not, I'm not the best self-promoter.
Hey, listen, you and me both. Between the two of us, though, we should be able to help each other out.
Yeah, for sure.
Listen, Demetri, man, this has been great. I love every chance you and I get to talk to each other, and I'm so delighted that this time there'll be plenty of people that get a chance to actually eavesdrop on this conversation and get to know you a little bit better, and hopefully tune into your work, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm a very proud subscriber to your service, and I listen eagerly to everything you put out. So thank you for all the hard work you do, because nobody prepares more for these podcasts than you do. It bewilders me how much work you put into these. It really does, and it shows. Every episode's been fantastic.
I appreciate you saying that. It's actually a good point too, which is I did say I have a paid subscription model, but if people want to support the program and gain access to things like the episode overtime, because I usually record for 2 hours, the second hour is always behind the paywall, and that's oftentimes the best content is in the second hour, as well as the rundowns, which are the notes and the transcripts. Those are all available on patreon.com/Hidden Forces. And I also want to say, Grant, listen, man, I have so much respect for you, as you know, but the thing that I've learned the most from you, it isn't your amazing newsletters, which I love to read. And by the way, they've gotten better and better, and I love the formatting, and I love the sort of the design. They've really gotten wonderful. But I'll tell you something, the thing that I've learned from you that is most unique to you is you're the most gracious, giving person I've ever met in this industry. And for a long time, I didn't have that attitude. I think, especially because I was more insecure, and for all sorts of reasons, but watching you operate for so many years and how gracious you are with the integrity that you operate, I've tried to hold myself to that standard. And so I found in the last year, by giving more without thinking about, because oftentimes I've in my life kind of been concerned about not necessarily transactional relationship, but not getting screwed over or whatever else. Seeing someone like you operate successfully in this world is incredibly inspiring. And I just want to say that of all the things I've learned from you, it's that, and I'm just deeply appreciative of it. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Well, mate, I'm incredibly touched. That means the world to me. Thank you. Mate, hopefully we will see each other soon. For now, I will let you go. But listen, thanks for sparing all this time. It's been an absolute blast.
Thank you, Grant.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.